I used to be a staff member of the McMahon Center for Public Policy. Back in the 1980s, I was executive director of the Idaho Freedom to Work Committee, and I was a founding board member in 2011 of the Michigan Freedom to Work Coalition. I want to thank Professor Tokarev for this opportunity to be with you here tonight. Welcome to those of you who are not from the Midland area. And if you're here from out of state, let me be the first to welcome you to America's newest right-to-work state. I also want to welcome you to Midland. We're proud to have a university like Northwood University in our community that is committed, passionately so, to advancing the freedom principle and philosophy. The freedom principle evokes passion. Certainly does for me. I've been to Tarrytown, New York, to the Foundation for Economic Education, and their events similar to this when I was quite a bit younger. I've spent a lot of my life committed to advancing the freedom philosophy. Hopefully there'll be some of you in this audience tonight who will catch that fire and that passion and who will commit yourselves to promoting and sharing and educating your peers about the freedom philosophy. It doesn't just evoke a passion with those of us who are involved academically. Let me tell you about a young man that I met when he was 23 years old, and he was a Teamster forklift driver in Idaho. And he got a letter from the Teamsters Union telling them that for the next 6 months or so, they were going to take $2 out of his paycheck, whether he liked it or not, to finance the Idaho AFL-CIO's campaign against Idaho's new right-to-work law, which was going to appear on the ballot. Corey Lane contacted our office and said that because of that $2, he wanted to take a stand in favor of the principle that people ought to be free to have a job in that state, I believe in America, without being forced to give money to any private organization against his will. Do you really think it was the $2 that were a burden to him? Or was it the burden on his conscience that he was being forced as a condition of keeping his job under threat of being fired to help finance a campaign that he did not personally believe in? The right-to-work law, if you're not familiar with what it is, and Michigan is the newest state to have passed one, just went into effect in 2012. We like to call it the miracle in Michigan. Michigan, the birthplace of American organized labor, passed a law in December of 2012 saying that as an employee in this state, if you want to choose to join and financially support a labor union, you can. But thereafter, you could no longer be forced to do so under threat of being fired. It's not just an individual freedom issue, it's a matter of rights of conscience, so that you are not, as an employee, compelled to pay for things you don't believe in. It also happens to be a major factor in a state's ability to attract new business and industry. Right-to-work states in this country have led our country in job creation by hundreds of thousands, millions of jobs. In population growth, Americans vote with their feet. 5 million Americans moved in the last decade from non-right-to-work states into states that had greater growing economies because they protected the individual's freedom to choose in the workplace. And it also happens to have resulted in faster income growth in those states where individuals are free to choose. You're going to hear later this week from Larry Reed, former president of the McMahon Center for Public Policy. He's currently president of the Foundation for Economic Education. And I had the privilege of meeting Larry in Idaho in the 1980s when I was running the campaign to pass a right-to-work law there. Larry's group was called the Center for the Study of Market Alternatives. And his group presented an award to me and to, how many of you are old enough to know, ever heard of Charlton Heston? You may know who that is, the guy who played Moses in the Ten Commandments. Or Ben-Hur, he was president of the National Rifle Association. Here was a guy who was a multimillionaire, could have lived in comfort, and yet as a former president of the Screen Actors Guild, AFL-CIO, a former union president himself, put himself outside of his comfort zone, did a television commercial endorsing the right-to-work law in the state of Idaho, which our polling indicated is the reason we won, and subjected himself to death threats and boycotts in Hollywood, threats to strip him of his lifetime membership in the Screen Actors Guild. Here's a guy who could have lived comfortably throughout the rest of his life, but he chose to take a stand for freedom. Not only that issue, but later for your Second Amendment gun rights. Do you think it had anything to do with the money involved? Or do you think he had a passion for freedom? Larry Reed, who you'll hear from later this week, used to gather in his home in Boise, Idaho, before he returned to Northwood University and to Midland to become the president of the Mackinac Center for Public Policy, people from all over the world. I remember one night he had somebody who was a Mujahideen freedom fighter from Afghanistan back in the day when they were fighting the Soviets in Afghanistan. And Wojciech Modelski, who was the founder of the Solidarity Youth Movement in Poland. And a couple of the members of the Shah of Iran's family who had been expelled from Iran from all over the world had come together in a little community out in Idaho into Larry Reed's home because they shared a passion for freedom. Corey Lane and Charlton Heston have their counterparts here in Michigan, like Terry Bowman and Brian Pannebacker of the United Auto Workers. I want to read to you a quote about the right to work principle. I think I'll surprise you at the end when I tell you who said this. In a right to work state, it is totally voluntary whether or not you decide to join the union and pay union dues. If you think your local union is doing a good job representing you in negotiations for improvements, then we hope you'll join. If you feel it isn't, then it is your right not to join. Fairly simple description of the freedom principle, isn't it? It's your right to choose for yourself. This goes on to say, this law speaks to one narrow issue. The right to work law means that employees have a right to join or not join the union. It is the employee's choice. It does not mean that workers don't have the right to form unions. They do. In fact, there are many workers all over the country who have strong, effective unions in so-called right-to-work states. I'm reading from the United Auto Workers recruitment manual for a Mercedes plant in Alabama. And I agree 100% with how the United Auto Workers in Alabama described right to work, even though they're critical of it when they're fighting the same battle over that issue here in Michigan. It's not just freedom. It's the fact that freedom works. It works economically. When people are free to choose what they believe to be in their own self-interest, and we hope it's our job, it's going to be part of your job, hopefully to make it enlightened self-interest, then people end up, as John Kennedy said, a rising tide lifts all boats. If we're all free to choose, then we're all going to get the best outcomes in life. And if we're motivated to do our best to provide a product at the best price and best quality in the marketplace, we're going to enrich ourselves and enrich society all around us. The freedom principle works, and it evokes passion. I know the hope of Professor Tokarev and others tonight is that we can light a passion and a fire in your heart for the freedom principle. People have been willing to die for that principle, and it's in the noblest of the American tradition that we've been willing to die not just for our own freedom, but for others' freedom. Thomas Paine, who was a columnist during the American Revolution, wrote, "What we obtain too cheaply, we esteem too lightly. It is dearness only that gives everything its value. Heaven knows how to put a price on its goods, and it would be a strange thing indeed if so celestial a thing as freedom should not be highly rated." Given the passion that the freedom principle evokes, I often ask myself, why don't we use it more often? Why don't we apply it not only in the marketplace, but in education, in all aspects of life? Give people the freedom to choose. Let others freely compete to meet the needs and desires of consumers who are free to choose, and that rising boat, that rising tide will lift all boats. That's what this whole week is about. I'm a candidate for the State House of Representatives. If I get elected, Lord willing, next Tuesday, I'll come back next year and give you an official welcome to next year's second annual Northwood University Freedom Week. I wish you a good rest of the week, and I hope we can light that fire and that you'll decide to go out and spend your lives fighting for the freedom principle. Thanks so much, and have a good session.
Fraser Institute, Brett McMahon.
Chair of Economic Freedom Research at the Fraser Institute, the Dr. Michael A. Walker Chair. And today I'm going to explain something about economic freedom, its background, how the project started, its extent, what economic freedom is, and the outcomes of economic freedom. If you give me a second, I'll set up the PowerPoint presentation now. Well, economic freedom, we do an annual report and have been since the mid-1990s. However, the project started about 10 years before that. The objective was to find a way to measure economic freedom, and once measuring it, to test the connections between it and other variables such as prosperity, economic growth, tolerance, democracy, and other freedoms. It was led by Michael Walker and the late Milton and Rose Friedman, and the research phase involved 60 of the world's top scholars, including 3 Nobel laureates. The authors are Jim Gortney, Bob Lawson, and Joshua Hall. All the data is third-party. We don't produce any of the data ourselves. This is very important. We want the index to be as objective as possible, and to make it as objective as possible, we avoid using our subjective judgments in collecting the data. We look at 42 variables affecting economic freedom, and we rank 151 countries plus Hong Kong, and that accounts for 95% of the world's population. This is the simple and classic definition of economic freedom. Individuals have economic freedom when the property they acquire without the use of force, fraud, or theft is protected from physical invasions by others, and they are free to use, exchange, or give their property so long as their actions do not violate the identical rights of others. We look at 5 areas of economic freedom. Size of government and taxation. Government reduces your economic freedom when it taxes away your property or interferes in the marketplace through government enterprises, subsidies, and so on. The next area we look at is private property and the rule of law. This is, we think, the most important area of economic freedom. If your property is not protected, and if the rule of law is not fairly written and enforced, then your economic freedom can be reduced by the rich and the powerful. You find crony capitalism, which is not economic freedom at all, where the rule of law is weak. Sound money, government can tax away your property every bit as easily through inflation as it can through taxation. Trade regulations and tariffs, you should be able to buy and sell from anyone in your country and from anyone around the world. In regulation of business, labor, and capital markets, you should be able to start a business or shut down a business when you wish, hire whom you wish or work for whom you wish, and borrow from whom you wish or lend to whom you wish. Talk about making a difference. We now have member institutes of our World Economic Freedom Network in 90 countries and territories. One of the most amazing things about this is that we have members from countries who may not like each other, but our members work together to support economic freedom. So, for instance, we have a member in Israel and a member in the Gaza Strip. We have a member institute in Venezuela, and we have a member institute in Colombia. We have a member institute in Georgia and a member institute in Russia. and it's now the subject of a major documentary which has been shown on many PBS stations and around the world, Changing Lives, Economic Freedom in Action. If you want to order a DVD, you'll see the address at the bottom of the screen. We also do a number of translations, subnational and regional indexes. We're particularly proud of this one, the economic freedom of the Arab world at this vital time. We all know what's going on there, and unfortunately, it's not just, and obviously the sectarian war is dividing many countries, and in those countries where there isn't a sectarian war and where the situation is stable, unfortunately, there's little drive towards increased economic freedom. This is due to a fraud that many national governments and, unfortunately, international institutions perpetrated on the people of these nations. They told them that throughout the 2000s, they were undergoing what was in the region called neoliberal reform. Unfortunately, it was nothing of the sort. It was the development of crony capitalism with members of the elite and government going from controlling assets through the state to controlling assets through crony capitalism. Unfortunately, this period of false reform had turned many people off to real free market reform. There are signs of optimism, however, in Tunisia, Morocco, and Jordan. Economic freedom of North America. We look at the economic freedom of the Canadian provinces, the U.S. states, and the Mexican states. This is a separate publication for Mexico, the one for Latin India, a Spanish translation from Europe, the economic freedom of the individual German states. Now I'll introduce the 2014 Economic Freedom of the World Index, released October 7 in Brussels. This is the cover of the report. These are the top 10 nations, and you'll see actually that, as I mentioned, Jordan is one of the positive areas of economic freedom. Now, I should have mentioned earlier when discussing the Arab world that some of the Gulf states are actually doing quite well. The United Arab Emirates is part of the top 10. Oman does very well. But in the non-Gulf states, Jordan has moved up to join the top 10. And as I mentioned, there are also signs of hope in Tunisia and Morocco. These are the bottom 10 nations, and as you can see, these are not places where you'd want to live. They aren't even nice places to visit. The average level of economic freedom around the world has increased over time. From the 1980s on, people realized that or policymakers realized that the drive and ingenuity of individuals and families beat government planning and government interference in the economy hands down every day of the week. And economic freedom grew pretty steadily. There was a small and has been a small reverse since the financial crisis. But while people talk an awful lot about the financial crisis, places with economic freedom are still by far the most prosperous and best places to live in the world. Why is economic freedom important? Economic rights are fundamental rights in the sense that without them there can be no political or civil freedoms. Let me explain that in two ways. If government or crony capitalists control your ability to make a living, feed and clothe your family, get a promotion and travel, they have all the tools of suppression of other freedoms and suppression of democracy, suppression of free speech, because if you exercise these freedoms in a way contrary to those in control, then they can shut down your ability to earn a living, travel, feed your family, and so on. They can shut it down until the anger overwhelms the barriers, as it did in the Arab world after the era of phony reform. The other thing is, and this is terribly important, and it helps explain some of the perversities in the Arab world and elsewhere. Without economic freedom, the people in control of the people in power also control the economy. It means they can pass out favors to friends, families, tribes, sectarian groups, and this tends to divide people against each other. So you want your group, whether it's a tribe or a religious sect or a kin network, to be in power, because those in power also monopolize the wealth of the country. And this sets up tribe against tribe, group against group, sectarian group against sectarian group, because without economic freedom, the winner, those in power, take all. And again, you see this much in the Arab world. For instance, in Iraq right now, when the Shias took control of the government, they tried to exclude the Sunnis, and the Sunnis, and that caused much of the damage going on now. Economic freedom changes that whole dynamic. Instead of setting group against group, members of other groups become your customers, your suppliers, your employees, fellow business people and trade associations. So it cuts across these bounds. And instead of winning by suppressing the wealth and freedom of others, in an economically free society, you can only get ahead by producing goods and services that others voluntarily want to buy. In other words, you can only get ahead by making people better off. This is a hugely different dynamic than in a non-economically free society, where winner takes all and you get ahead only by making other groups worse off. Economic freedom also drives growth and prosperity. As I mentioned before, we have more than a century of evidence to show that individual drive and ingenuity beats government planning every day of the week. Now, I'm going to show you some slides that are simply snapshots in time. They show correlation, but correlation is not causation. However, the important thing to bear in mind here is that the correlations I'm about to show you have in fact been explored in about 400 to 500 academic and policy articles that have explored this with the most powerful empirical tools available, and find that there is a line of causation flowing from economic freedom to a number of good results. First, we'll look at per capita income and economic freedom. To the left of the screen is the most economically free quartile, and to the right of the screen, the least economically free quartile. As you'll see, the average per capita GDP in the most free countries is nearly $40,000. In the least free countries, it's only around $6,000. This is growth, and as you can see, the more economically free you are, the faster your economy grows. Now, a lot of people say, sure, economic freedom and free markets produces growth and prosperity, but prosperity only for the richest. It simply increases inequality and the poor get poorer. This slide shows you the income share of the poorest 10%. Now, an economist would look at this and say, well, that looks like a random walk. It doesn't really look like there's much of a pattern there. The poorest 10% get a slightly higher percentage. The poorest 10% get a slightly higher percentage of national income in the most free countries than in the least free countries, but it doesn't look very significant. The lesson to take away from this is that economic freedom doesn't increase inequality, but it doesn't reduce it either. But now this is where you see the results of this. Because economic freedom generates such powerful growth and prosperity, the same percentage of national income in an economically free country for the poorest 10% produces a much higher level of real income than the poorest 10% in the least free countries. So the poorest 10% of the population in the most free countries in the world have an average income of about $11,000 a year. The poorest 10% in the least free countries have an average income of under $1,000 a year. In other words, less than 10% of the average income of the poorest 10% in the most free nations. And this doesn't capture many of the least economically free countries like North Korea or Cuba, because there simply isn't the data to put them in the index. Economic freedom, governance, and democracy. This is from Freedom House, and I mentioned before the dynamics about how economic freedom liberates you from government control so you can exercise other freedoms and your democratic rights. And you'll see here that economically free nations have a much higher level of democracy than non-economically free nations. These civil rights or civil freedoms, and again you see the same patterns with people in economically free countries having a much higher level of other freedoms. Economic freedom and corruption. Lack of economic freedom is the raw fuel for corruption. If you need to ask somebody's permission to do something, if you aren't free to do it on your own, then there's always someone who can take a bribe or stop you unless you pay them off. On the other hand, if you're living in an economically free country and you don't need somebody's permission to do something, then there's no one to pay off. No corruption. Economic freedom and other indicators of well-being. This is a very interesting chart. This is economic freedom and life satisfaction, which is interchangeable in the literature with happiness. People on the left, those who opposed economic freedom, have long argued, well, we shouldn't be looking at GDP, maybe free markets create more prosperity. What we should be looking at is happiness, and happiness isn't necessarily correlated with prosperity. But what we've discovered, or what researchers in the social sciences have discovered, is that life satisfaction or happiness is actually higher in economically free countries than in non-economically free countries, regardless of the level of income. So if you're in an economically free country with an average income of, say, $20,000, you're happier than someone in a non-economically free country with the same level of income, at least on average. Now, of course, if you're in an economically free country, you're likely growing quicker. There's more reason for optimism for the future. And another thing which researchers think affects this is you are happier when you feel more in control of your life. And of course, you're more in control of your life when you're free to make your own decisions. And this is literacy. And as you can see, two very interesting patterns here. One, in economically free countries, the level of literacy is much, much higher than in non-economically free countries. And perhaps at least as importantly, the gap between girls and boys, between men and women in literacy in economically free countries is much lower than in non-economically free countries. Life expectancy. The life expectancy is much higher in economically free countries than in non-economically free countries. So the conclusions of looking at this, and as I mentioned, the slides were just correlations, but they have been shown in rigorously tested, peer-reviewed literature. Economic freedom increases prosperity. It reduces poverty. It may not reduce inequality, but it does reduce poverty powerfully. It increases other freedoms and improves the quality of life. The Fraser Institute makes all its research material available for free on its website, so you can go to www.freetheworld.com, and that will have all the economic freedom research that the Fraser Institute has participated in available for free download. You can also pick it up at www.fraserinstitute.org, and there you can pick up the economic freedom research as well as a full range of other research that the Fraser Institute participates in. Thank you very much for your attention and your interest.
Our next guest speaker is from Hillsdale College and is Gary Wolfram.
This is Gary Wolfram, and I want to say that I wouldn't be here if it weren't for our IT person, Heidi. And I'd like to talk for a few minutes about pay differentials and whether it's important that the latest controversy is that women earn 77 cents for every dollar that men do. Well, first of all, let's just see what's going on. This thing lumps all men and women together so that if you have, regardless of type of employment, so let's say men are most of the NCAA football coaches are men, and they earn about $3 million. And if you look at hedge fund managers, they earn lots of money, and they are primarily men. And so what this will do is skew the average, so it looks like men make more than women because women are being discriminated against. Now, U.S. Department of Labor did a study to try to look at these things and see, can we break out the components that are important for being employed and what salary you'll get. And the first thing they looked at was work hours. And it turns out that men work a lot more hours than women do. And so that would skew it so that men make more in terms of absolute wages than women do. Second, they looked at occupation and industry. So it says, okay, where are men employed and where are women employed? And men, of course, tend to be occupied in industries that are higher wage. We just talked about NCAA football coaches and hedge fund managers, but they make up the majority of doctors, and they make up a majority of most of the high-wage industries. Now, I may say that this is going to be, that gap is going to be closing in the future since women are beginning to move into these industries, not necessarily NCAA football coaches, but you see more women hedge fund managers and the like. Next thing they looked at was experience. How long have you been working in the occupation that you're in? And it turns out that women generally have less experience. But as women begin to become more accepted into the workplace, or they accept themselves into the workplace, then what you'll notice is that gap is going to get smaller as well. Another thing they looked at is career interruption. The problem here is that if you are in a job and let's say you're gone for 5 years, most of you out there have an iPhone or some other type of mobile phone. If you have one that's 3 years old, you're probably thinking, hey, this is an old phone. What am I doing with this thing? You'll be complaining to your parents or to your wife or whatever that you've got this old beat-up phone. Well, suppose that you're out of the labor force for 5 years. All those skills that are changing very quickly, you will have lost some, or you won't even pick them up. So people who leave the labor force for periods of time tend to get paid less because when they re-enter, they won't have the same job skills as the person who stayed in the occupation for the full time. Another thing that they looked at is education and what's called human capital. That is, what sort of job skills do you have? And men had more education in general, and they had more job skills. But notice that this gap is going to close as well, because right now, most of you probably know, that women make up a higher percentage of students in colleges and universities than men do. So as that filters out through time, and 10, 15 years from now, then that gap of education and job skills is going to be much smaller than it is now. If you account for all these factors, it turns out that women earn about 95 cents for every dollar that men earn. And if you think about it, this gap's got to close over time. So why do we, although this is a differential, it is not something on the order of 77 cents per dollar. It's more on the order of 95 cents per dollar, and we would expect to see that changing over time as women move into higher-paying occupations, as they send children to daycare and don't stay at home, and so don't break their career up. And so again, we would expect this thing, if you're sitting here 10 years from now, probably nobody would be talking about this pay gap. Now, why might we expect that the market would not result in serious pay differentials between men and women? Well, let's think about it for a minute. Suppose that I pay women $8 an hour and they make $10 an hour worth of stuff. And you pay men $10 an hour and they make $10 an hour worth of stuff. Well, what should happen over time? I make an economic profit. And if we remember our principles of economics, if economic profits being made, other firms will enter the industry, and that will, as those firms enter the industry, what are they going to do? They're going to be hiring women. As they hire women, the demand for women's labor goes up, and women's wages would go up. So we wouldn't expect it to be an equilibrium where men and women producing the same value get paid differently. Those folks that hired women and paid them a little bit more than the one next to you are just going to be able to compete those women away. I mean, we can take this even farther. I mean, suppose men discriminate against women and that they don't even want to hire them. Well, what happens, suppose that a man makes $10 an hour worth of stuff and a woman makes $12 an hour worth of stuff. What will happen? That sets up a cost of discriminating for men. If I'm going to pay men and I'm not going to hire women, and women are making more stuff per hour than men, the cost to me of hiring a man and not hiring a woman is going to be that $12 an hour or $2 an hour, the differential. So what we'd expect over time is that differential to close. That can't be an equilibrium because there's an opportunity cost of deciding to not hire women. Now, if I have to pay men and women the same, that doesn't allow women to offer their labor at a lower rate and therefore get hired into the labor force. There's no opportunity cost of discriminating. If I have to pay women $10 and men $10, and I don't want to hire women, then that opportunity cost is lowered. So what we ought to think about a little bit is whether this gap really exists, and if it does exist, it must be existing because there are market reasons and that there are differentials in the productive capacity or in the job occupations that women earn. Now, think about what's going to be happening in the near future. Men earn 88% fewer college degrees than women do. Their long-term unemployment rate is 55%, while for women it's 45%. That is, if you're unemployed, if you've been unemployed longer than 26 weeks, 55% of the men have been unemployed longer than 26 weeks, and only 45% of the women. Young single men earn less than young single women in 147 out of 150 largest cities. So, in summary, A, it's not likely this price differential is empirically there. B, to the extent it is, it's small. C, it should not exist over time because market forces will result in men and women being paid what we call the value of their marginal product. And over time, we would expect this differential to close as women get more college degrees, as women enter labor occupations that pay higher salaries, and as they remain in the labor force longer. So with that, I think we have a couple minutes for questions, if anyone would like to do that. And, you know, if you don't ask questions, we're just going to call on you. Right? I mean, we're economics professors. That's what we do for a living.
Debate, this discussion that we are having currently, I'm pretty sure it's not just on this campus, it's on your campus and many other campuses. Do you think that this will finally put an end to the silly political argument that there is such a thing as the war on women being fought with economic means?
The short answer is no. The political argument is out there of what the data show or what would make economic sense. For example, if you think about minimum wage, I mean that's another thing that is a big issue politically, and any economist can tell you a minimum wage discriminates against those people that can't produce $10 an hour worth of stuff, and those would be the unskilled, and those would be in our urban centers, poorly educated. But that is not what the average person thinks. So if I run ads on television that say men make $1 for every 77 cents that women do, how many will have even sat in your class and listened to this, or will have looked at the Heritage Foundation or Cato Institute? Not many. So it will still be used. What is necessary is for people to do what you're doing. That is to actually find out what the data show, and also to think about the logic of what that argument would be.
We have one question.
It couldn't be somebody that was sitting on the end.
Major in my microeconomics theory course.
How does paid maternity leaves for women play into the wage discrimination scenario?
Well, certainly, that's a very good question. Maternity leaves will do what? Make it more expensive for me to hire a woman. Because, A, I'm going to have to replace her if she's on maternity leave, and B, she's going to perhaps lose skills in the meantime, and C, the person that replaces her probably doesn't know as much about the company that she does. So if you think about it, that says that women are going to be more expensive. And if they're going to be more expensive to hire because of this benefit, then what will happen is I'll offer them lower wages. So a woman gets $8 an hour plus maternity leave, a man gets $9 an hour, and it looks like there's a pay differential, but there really isn't. In fact, that's true of all benefits when you sort of think about it. If you're the employer, you care about the full package. You don't care about what the salary is and the benefits are separately. If you got to pay $12 an hour and 8s in salary and 4s in benefits, it's the same as if you paid $12 and had no benefits. To the extent that women get more benefits than men, as in maternity leave, then I'm going to offer them lower wages.
From the Friedrich Neumann Foundation for Freedom in Bulgaria, it's Daniel Kaddik.
Hello? Can you see me? Can you hear me? Perfect. So first, thanks for having me. If you hear some screams from somewhere behind me, that's not my wife that I'm killing, it's just my little daughter that's just 6 weeks old and is depriving me of all the little sleep I get in my job. I want to talk a little bit about migration in Europe and the liberal perspective on that. And I'm in a unique position because I lived in 8 of the 16 German states and in 3 European countries and some others as well. And I currently live in Bulgaria, which gives me an interesting insight in the current migration debate in Europe, as I took the exact opposite route than most of the migrants in Europe, from one of the receiving country to one of the main sending countries in Europe. And to give you a little perspective, since 1990, Bulgaria has lost around 2 of its 8 million inhabitants. So in this lecture, we will talk about the costs and benefits of immigration from a liberal perspective and identify some problems caused by government intervention in this market. And when I say liberal, I'm talking about the proper understanding of this word, which some of you might refer to as libertarianism or classic liberalism. When I say libertarianism or libertarian, I refer to a theoretic construct in an ideal world. So what is migration? Migration is the movement of people from one place to another with the intention of settling temporarily or permanently in the new location. And in the past decades, we have seen a dramatic shift in the very nature of migration. In the past, it has been a very slow process. Modern forms of transportation increase the dynamic in labor mobility. And if we compare it a little bit to free trade has many supporters. Of course, there are always attempts to restrict it for the benefits of some interest groups, but in principle, many are of the opinion that goods should cross borders freely. That changes very quickly when it comes to giving those freedoms to people. Or to be more accurate to say, when it comes to the future workforce to compete in the domestic labor market of another country. So I will now try to somehow switch on the PowerPoint presentation. Ron told me that would work, and I really hope it does. Otherwise, you will see my notes and not the presentation. So, do you see the presentation at the moment? It just appeared. And when I do this, you see my notes, right? Well, that is not good. Okay, that's not how it should be. So I will switch every once in a while and explain you what I'm doing at the moment then. So I will stop sharing my notes with you, even though you can have them afterwards if you like. Well, in Europe we have 3 dimensions of migration. That one is inner country, and that is usually not a matter of discussion. A repetitive study in Germany shows that Western Germans are not very keen on living next to Turkish neighbors, but they are also not very keen on living next to Eastern German neighbors or to Western German neighbors. And the same goes for Eastern Germans if you ask them about Western Germans and Eastern Germans as well. So Germans don't like neighbors or migrants as such. When we come to migration within Europe and to Europe, it's a completely different story. Migration is in the European, or in Europe's DNA, so to say, if you look at the history of mass migration in Europe. And it's one of the fundamental rights of EU citizens like myself. Still, currently only 3% of EU citizens live in another EU country other than their own birth country. In other words, inner EU migration is not a major phenomenon. Immigration into the EU 15 zone, so Germany, France, Netherlands, Britain, has shown a steady increase in the last years. So if you look at 2011, where we have the most reliable numbers. We have 33.3 million foreigners living in the EU 27, now EU 28, of which around 20.5, so 2/3, were from third countries. More than 75 of the foreigners living in the EU are spread over the EU 5 countries, that is Germany, Spain, Italy, United Kingdom, and France. And Romania and Romanian and Turkish citizens, approximately 2.3 million each, make up the largest groups in the EU, followed by Moroccans and Polish. So despite this history, these rights and these numbers, there is a heated discussion since about January, since about 2013, because since January 2014, all people in the European Union can exercise the free movement within the EU, also from the poorest countries. So no wonder that in 2013 the Conservative Party started campaigning against this. So just to give you an idea of what I mean about that is, well, that's not working again. So we had that already in 2005 when there was the first wave of introducing these rights to new EU citizens. And there was a phenomenon called the Polish plumber in France. The French right-wing groups try to lobby or try to, well, rally against Polish workers. They're coming there, and they invented the Polish plumber that would take away the jobs of the French people. So people in France would vote no for a referendum on the EU constitution. So, and now I will try to share it. Let's share my screen. Go. And Poland reacted with that picture. Can you see that? Yes. So that basically says in French, if I can't come to I'm staying in Poland, you should visit me. And we have also currently in Europe this debate about should we have migrants or not. And the general feeling of people towards this is quite negative, if you can see, especially in Britain and France. There is a lot of resentment against migrants. But funny thing, and I have this graph from a recent article in The Economist, over time, since the 1960s, people have always been reacting very negatively to immigration. Has it gone too far? Most people have said yes, even though there has been very little immigration at that point in time. And actually, the responses have more or less stayed the same over the course of time, even though the migration has increased tremendously. So what we have in Europe at the moment quite a lot is guys like this. This is Nigel Farage from the United Kingdom Independence Party, who's making a lot of fuss about migrants coming to the UK and especially his country. So they are saying that the migrants are a massive threat to their local services, to their to what they have, to the social security. And then there's a question, of course, in the UK, how much more can we take? So, and this Nigel Farage opens a question of, or says that the British public is generally concerned about opening up the borders to Bulgarian Romanians. And they are concerned because they will take away their jobs. And, well, if you look at the huge wage gap and the huge wealth gap we have in Europe, that is understandable that some people might get this kind of idea. The average income in Germany is monthly $2,824. In Bulgaria, for instance, it's $461 a month. So that explains why there are currently headlines like Germany increasingly popular with immigrants, or 1.2 million people immigration at the highest level in 20 years. I would have shown you some pictures of how that looks like actually, but I will just skip that. So Germany's net migration is at a plus of 437,000 just in the last year. And the Institute for Employment Research suggests that over the course of this year, approximately up to 180,000 Bulgarians and Romanians will come to Germany alone. So as indicated, that not necessarily sparks happiness in a lot of people, and they call for migration restriction. But these immigration controls hurt three fears. Hard English word, fears. So first one is economy. And there are good reasons to believe that the economic benefits for freer migrations are large, not just for the immigrants themselves, but also for the receiving population. In a globalized world where the economy is ever-changing and opportunities no longer stop at national borders, it is normal and desirable for people to move freely, not just within the country, but also internationally. This is true for the Polish plumber as it is for the German business people. Just as the free movement of goods and services is beneficial due to that of people who produce goods and services. And Harvard's Len Pritchett found that removing immigration barriers worldwide would double the worldwide GDP, increasing an increase of $65 trillion annually. So for your reference, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, the European Commission estimates and argues that it would boost the EU's economy by 120 billion, the US economy by 90 billion, and the rest of the world by approximately 100 billion. So the emerging pan-European labor market is extending the gains of the EU single market, encouraging the allocation of labor to its most efficient use. It enables countries that open their labor markets to specialize in what it does best. Economies of scale foster dynamic clusters and improve the variety, quality, and cost of local products and services. Increased mobility also makes the economy more flexible, allowing it to adapt more radially to change and thus boosting growth and stability. Last but not least, foreigners' diversity and dynamic competition, innovation and enterprise, raising long-term productivity, growth, and living standards. This is widely accepted that Germany benefits from free trade, not just within the EU single market, but also globally. Presumably, then, the emergence of a pan-European labor market also benefits Germany. After all, when Germans go abroad for surgery, it is considered trade. And when foreign surgeons come to Germany, it's called migration. Yet the economic impact of the operations on the existing German population is equivalent. But where services have to be delivered locally, all people cannot care from afar. Taxi drivers have to operate locally, food and drink have to be served face-to-face. International migration is the only form of international trade that is possible. And just as it is often cheaper and mutually beneficial to import closer from China and IT service from India, it often makes sense to import services that have been delivered on the spot. Germans accept that it's mutually beneficial to import professional services from Americans, be they in New York or London. Surely the same logic applies for the Polish plumber, the Indian IT worker, the Filipino care workers, Congolese cleaners, and Brazilian bar staff. So low-skilled jobs still account for over a quarter of the German workforce. But the supply of low-skilled workers is shrinking fast, and less skilled older workers retire and younger ones with higher aspiration replace them. Whereas 79% of the 55 to 64-year-olds have finished upper secondary education, 84 of 25 to 34-year-olds have. While even those with no qualification do not want to do certain dirty, difficult, and dangerous jobs. Mostly, though, immigrants take job, yes? Okay, I will try my best. It's just, yeah. Mostly through immigrants take jobs that local workers can't or won't do, thus do not compete with them at all. On the contrary, immigrants often complement German work efforts, raising productivity and thus lifting their wages. So just consider the increasing cost of old age care in aging societies. So let's skip some things. Migrant workers face a different set of alternatives, since wages in Germany are multiple of those, for instance, in the Philippines, and Filipinos are happy to do such work. And it's not exploitation. It makes everyone, migrants, taxpayers, German, young and old, better off. It does not undercut wages, since locals do not want to do the jobs in the first place. So the conventional wisdom in Germany is that Germany may benefit from high-skilled immigration, but not from lower-skilled variety of economically illiterate. But it's like arguing that Germany benefits from importing American software, but not from Chinese cloth. So a selective immigration policy cannot possibly determine the right number or a mix of people the country needs, let alone how these will evolve in the future. I will also skip the part about the income, the raising income globally. Just two very short sentences about politics. Migration policy is usually used as a deterrent, but controls are ineffective and counterproductive. I just want to refer to the war on drugs in the United States, which probably students in the United States are quite familiar with. It needs a costly control mechanism, and those are far from stopping migration, and they mainly drive it to underground, damaging society rather than protecting it. And migration is often seen as an invasion into the social system, but funnily enough, after Britain, Ireland, and Sweden in 2004 opened up to workers from new EU accession states, Britain and Ireland restricted their initial access to welfare benefit, but only 1% of the Polish migrants chose to go to Sweden and its generous welfare. So it can't be really true, can it? Also skip that. Just one thing about a political dilemma, and that is how do migrants adapt to values, norms, and culture and language? And that is one of the major debating points at the moment. Last but not least, question of moral. Liberals have always argued for open borders to allow free movement of people as being economically beneficial for the receiving countries, but it's also part of people's right of self-determination. Freedom is freedom of movement is one of the basic human rights. Also, as you can find in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And if you look at the fact that more than 3,000 refugees and migrants have already been killed this year trying to escape poverty from Africa and the Middle East, just trying to break into fortress Europe, you can ask yourself whether it's really moral to keep them away. Just for your reference, in the last 15 years, around 6,000 immigrant migrants have died trying to get to the US, compared to 3,000 alone this year to Europe. So with this, I overextended my time a bit, but so did my predecessors in this job. Thank you very much for your patience with me. And if Alex allows, I am happy to answer one or two of your questions. First one.
All right, our next guest speaker is from the Cascade Policy Institute, Eric Fruits.
Hello, I hope you can hear me. Okay, great. Yeah, my name is Eric Fruits. I'm with Cascade Policy Institute, and I'm going to be talking about right to work. And I'm going to act like none of you know what right to work is. So let's just start with some basics. In about 26 states, employers and unions can have a deal. that makes the payment of union dues a condition of employment. That means to get a job with that employer, the employee must be a member of the union or pay dues to the union. So, for example, I'm a part-time teacher at Portland State University, but in order to teach at that university, I have to pay about $25 a month to the American Federation of Teachers, which is a teachers union. If I decided that I didn't want to pay those dues, I'd lose my job. When I was hired on, I was automatically paying dues. I'm not a union member, although they want me to be, but I'm not a union member, but I still have to pay those dues because of all the benefits that the union says that it provides to me. And if we have time, I could tell you that those benefits are really not worth the price that I'm paying. So those are in 26 states where you can have a deal that says you have to be a member of the union in order to have a job. Now there's another 24 states, so about half the states are known as right-to-work states. In those states, union membership is voluntary. So no employer can make its employees join a union as a condition for having a job. Now I know this is Freedom Week, and as just a fundamental principle of freedom, the idea of right to work seems to make more sense than having forced unionization. The idea that union membership should be voluntary and that the union should provide services that are so important and valuable that people want to join the union seems to be a fundamental right that's part of freedom. But I'm an economist, and some of those fundamental principles don't necessarily hold up. So what I've tried to do is try to say, okay, well, let's take a look at what happens in right-to-work states versus non-right-to-work states. So in other words, right-to-work states versus forced unionization states. Now, as one basic principle of economics, just mathematically, that there's this idea that anytime you loosen a constraint, no one can be made worse off. So if you loosen the constraint, get rid of forced unionization, then you would expect no one to really be worse off. And in fact, you might expect people to be better off. So then that raises a really important economics question, which is, do right-to-work states perform better or worse in terms of, say, job growth than forced unionization states? And so I've done a study. I used a panel of data across all 50 states over a long period of time, going as far back as 1947. And I tried to tease out what are the effects of right to work or forced unionization on employment. And so I'm going to switch over here to my PowerPoint, and let's hope it works. And so I guess, wave your hands if you can see it. Let's see. It should be there now. Do I see hand waves? Woo. Is it working? I will assume it's working. So what we have here is in the states that have forced unionization, in other words, those 26 states that require you to be a member of the union in order to have a job, you see that employment growth over time has roughly been about 1.3% a year. And so what we have here, each dot represents the year-over-year job growth. So here we are. This is the year, I think it's 1950 or so. And so that represents the job growth from 1949 to 1950 is about a little less than 6%. And you see that over time, job growth has declined. That's okay because you have a lot of things going on. You got to remember that those post-war years were really boom years. The other thing, too, is that over time, you have the baby boomers getting older, the labor force itself is shrinking, and so you see the employment growth is shrinking. Remember, anything above zero is good because that means you have positive growth. Anything below zero is bad. That means you have employment declines. And so the bottom line here is what I want you to look at is this line, and you see that it's roughly about 1.3% a year in annual job growth in the forced unionization states. Now, if you look in the employment in right-to-work states, employment in right-to-work states has been about 2.6% a year. And the dots get really confusing, so let's just get rid of the dots real quick here and just put the two lines. And we see now that employment in right-to-work states is roughly double the rate of employment growth in non-right-to-work states, in other words, in forced unionization states. And so you would say, gee, I mean, this is a slam dunk. We should be done. I could finish 5 minutes early, right to work wins, let's go away, because it's pretty clear that it works. Now let's step back for a second. Now the difference is only about 1.3%. And a lot of people say, well, gee, 1.3%, that's not a big deal. Who cares? 1.3% is pretty small. If my income increased by 1.3% next year, I probably wouldn't notice it. I probably wouldn't be able to buy that much more stuff. If my pay decreased by 1.3%, my pay probably wouldn't change that much. I probably wouldn't be able to buy that much less. But the thing is, you got to look over time. And there's a story, I've been trying to find an accurate quote. Einstein once said the most powerful force in the universe is compounded interest. And this figure right here really demonstrates it. Because if you look in those right-to-work states that have seen a 2.6% a year growth in employment, you'll see that since 1950, right-to-work states employment has nearly quintupled. That's 5 times if you don't know what quintuple means, and I'm sure you do. In the other states, the non-right-to-work states, in those non-right-to-work states, the states with forced unionization, their employment growth has only doubled since 1950. You could see how this has a big impact over time. Even just a 1.3% change can have a big impact over time. Okay, so we said that employment in right-to-work states is roughly double the rate of growth in non-right-to-work states, in the forced unionization states. But someone's going to say, wait, there's a lot of other things going on here. And they're right. Let's take a look. A lot of right-to-work states also tend to be pro-business. They tend to be pro-business in other ways, in addition to right-to-work. They tend to have lower taxes. They tend to have fewer regulations. And so what we need to do is tease out those other things. And this is where the econometrics, the application of statistics to economics, comes in. And when we account for other things, such as education, tax structure, and demographics, we find that we could tease out those impacts, and when we tease out those impacts, we find out that by itself, when you isolate those impacts of right-to-work boosts employment by 0.5% a year. Now, a lot of people are going to say that's nothing. 0.5%, big whoop. Well, if you look over time, if you look over a long period of time, say, 50, 60 years, that represents an entire generation of job growth. And so states that don't have right-to-work legislation, states that have forced unionization, actually lose an entire generation's worth of employment. And so if you had a state that switched over to right-to-work, you may not notice a difference next year or the year after that, or the year after that even, because the change is so small. But if you fast forward, within your lifetime, you will see big changes in employment growth in that state. Right-to-work seems to have a really big impact on employment growth because it relieves a lot of that additional constraints on the labor agreement and the labor contract. Now, I happen to be a big fan of Billy Mays, and I'm sad that he passed away, and I like to be kind of a salesman on this, and then we say, but wait, there's more. It's all 100% free. And what do we mean by free? Well, free, if you think about all the other things that government tries to do to boost employment, what do? They do tax cuts. I like tax cuts, and that's okay. They also like to do big spending on stimulus projects. But if you think about tax cuts, cost the state money because they have lower tax revenues, possibly. And you think about spending. Look at the stimulus. The stimulus was almost $1 trillion. That was $1 trillion in new spending. $1 trillion in new tax money that has to get spent somehow. Those are expensive. But right-to-work, all right-to-work takes is someone to just wave their magic wand, declare that their state is right-to-work, and it won't cost the state anything. So it's free. You can boost employment by just passing a law that says we don't allow forced unionization anymore. The employment contract is now voluntary. And with that, you will have employment growth that won't cost the state anything. So I know we're running out of time here, and I want to keep you guys on schedule. If you think about the benefits of right to work, it boosts employment, and usually goes hand in hand with other pro-employment policies, such as lower taxes and reduced government spending. And it's entirely free to the state that decides to enact right to work because it doesn't require spending money. You just pass the law and it works itself out. And so if we have time, I know it's 4 o'clock or 4 o'clock my time, 7 o'clock your time. I could take some questions, but if we need to move on, that's fine with me too.
Won't probably face this kind of objection on this campus, but somewhere else people might say, okay, those right-to-work states, they may be doing better in terms of job growth, but that's only because they suck some of the opportunities away from the states that have union protection. It's to them a race to the bottom. If everybody becomes a right-to-work state, will they still experience this kind of growth? How would you address this concern?
Well, I don't know if it actually sucks anything away from the non-right-to-work states. There may be some portion of that, and to be honest, I haven't thought about that too much. That's a great question. But really what it does is it makes it easier for people to enter into employment contracts. For example, I'm at Portland State University, and the union that I pay dues to negotiates my pay. I happen to teach in the business school. I teach economics. Business school professors, if you go to anywhere else, get paid more than, say, basket weaving professors. But because of the deal that my union made with the university, it doesn't matter if you teach basket weaving or economics or English, you get paid the same no matter what. And so in that sense, the union is actually depressing my wages. And one of the other parts that I didn't talk about in this talk is that you tend to see income growth, not just employment, but income growth increase in right-to-work states faster than in non-right-to-work states.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Great to be here. Thanks.
Our next speaker comes from the Mackinac Center for Public Policy. I hope I'm getting this name right. Jarrett Skorup? Skorup. Thank you.
All right, thanks for having me. I hope I get extra points for being here in person. Not too far of a trip, yeah. So I work for the Mackinac Center here in town. That's a free market economic think tank. We are the largest state-based think tank in the nation, and how lucky for you guys right here in Midland, Michigan. And we actually started here because the founding president of the organization, a guy named Larry Reed, was the chair of the economics department here at Northwood, and said, all right, I'll do this. 25 years ago he said, all right, I'll do this think tank, but it has to stay in Midland, because he wanted to be in Midland, which some of you that aren't from Midland maybe think, really? But all right, so I'm here to talk about minimum wage laws, and that's something that's been a lot in the news this past year. It's an election year, so it's an issue that's relatively popular with the general public, which means politicians are going to do something on it, because they tend to do that with issues that are popular, even if they are economically destructive. And minimum wage laws are economically destructive, though how much they are differs pretty greatly. So a lot of what you hear on minimum wage, the fights that you have, it deals a lot with numbers, and a lot of economists they're essentially arguing over how much a certain minimum wage law will affect the economy. So in Michigan, by bumping it to $9 an hour, what's that going to do versus $10 versus somewhere like Seattle, where they were talking about a $15 per hour minimum wage, and in some parts of the country that do have $15 an hour. I'm going to break this down a little bit simpler and talk this through in more logical terms, because depending on how wealthy a state is, that will depend on how much an uptick in the minimum wage law would be. So what I mean by that is, in America, if you had a $2 minimum wage, that would do almost nothing to the economy, because in a wealthy country where most people have value well above $2 an hour, and businesses are going to have to pay that much whether they want to or not, and of course most businesses don't want to. And so when the higher you're talking about for the minimum wage, the more of an effect it will have. But among the most basic laws of economics is that if you make something more expensive, you'll get less of it. And at its most basic form, minimum wage laws is making the cost of employing someone more expensive. So you're going to have less jobs. Go ahead and go to the first slide. This is the law of demand. So as the price of something rises, you'll get less of it. And minimum wage laws are the price of hiring somebody. The funny thing about minimum wage is that this is not controversial, and in most cases the left agrees with this. Economists on the left or right, this is a universally acknowledged thing. That's why when you talk about something like free trade, unions advocate for tariffs on goods that are coming into the country, because they understand if you can make those goods more expensive, we will buy less of them and we'll be forced to buy more from America. Now that's bad for other reasons, but the law of demand there holds. You're making goods more expensive so people will buy more in their own country. But a lot of people on the left, they seem to ignore this when it comes to minimum wage. That's why you have a lot of labor unions pushing the idea of a $15 minimum wage for fast food workers, for example. And a lot of that has to do with other issues besides economics, namely getting more membership. But still, the pretending that you can do that without having adverse effects is kind of silly. So I had a debate recently on this issue, and I asked during it, I said, what is the value of a minimum wage job? And my debate opponent thought about that for a second, and she said the value of that job is minimum wage, whatever the wage is. But that's actually incorrect. Because by a raise of hands, how many people here have ever worked for minimum wage or less? Including internships, keep that in mind, any wage that you work for. So most people, the vast majority of people. All right, raise your hands if you think for the rest of your life you're going to work for minimum wage or less. So no one. Everybody understands that minimum wage laws are meant to be temporary. They're meant to be something to get into the workforce. Now, the actual, so I asked what's the value of minimum wage law? The actual value is, go ahead and go to the next slide. The primary value of the minimum wage job is not for the pay today, but the skills it generates for the future. That's my son. He's 2 years old. I'm redoing my basement, and he was really helping out. So I'm violating child labor laws and minimum wage laws, but he was not a help at all. So really, he should pay me. I gave him food for this. Now, one of the main things that people believe about minimum wage is incorrect, and even conservatives. I go home, my parents are kind of generally conservative, but if not a little bit more apathetic. And now if you talk to my mom and say, why should we have a minimum wage? She says, well, that helps poor people. It helps people not become poor. We should maybe raise the minimum wage, and that'll help those people move up in the world. According to data from the U.S. Census Bureau and Bureau of Labor Statistics, for people who make under $10.10 an hour, everyone who makes under $10.10 an hour, about 15% of those people come from poor households. That is, come from families that the government classifies as poor. Only 15%. So the vast majority, 85%.
This meeting is about to end as the moderator has left the meeting.
Oh, that's okay. So 85% come from other households. 60% come from households that make more than the average income in this country. So most people making under $10.10 an hour are from relatively wealthy households. And the reason, the reason here to understand is that the problem of poverty in this country, go ahead and go to the next slide. The problem of poverty in the country is not largely about higher wages, it's about having a job. Because like you that all raise your hand about working under minimum wage or at minimum wage, you have to get your start before you can move up somewhere in the world. And the minimum wage is chopping the blocks off at the bottom of the ladder. They're preventing people from getting that first start. So wages are set by supply and demand in the marketplace. They're not set by just a government mandate. One of the false assumptions with minimum wage is that businesses set wages, but that's incorrect. Because if businesses set wages, I assure you they'd pay you nothing. Because every business wants to pay as little as they possibly can. And workers want to make as much as they possibly can, and the wage is the negotiation and what they come to. So right now in this country, if you want to make a lot of money, I would recommend, and I'm sorry, I know Northwood doesn't have the program, but I would be an oil and gas engineer, because the average starting salary of an oil and gas engineer right now is about $95,000 per year. Go ahead and go to the next slide. And your average wage is $160,000. Now, the other, what I have up there, that's a Walmart. That's a Walmart in North Dakota, and that's what they're hiring. I did see that the Walmart in Midland, what their wages that they were advertising was different than the one in North Dakota. Now, is this because oil and gas companies are just the most gracious companies in the world? They just love, they want to pay you because they're so gracious, and that Dow Chemical feels that way, and that's why they start their engineers a little bit higher. Or that the Walmart out in North Dakota is more generous than the Walmart here in Midland, Michigan. No, of course it's not. It's because they have to pay those wages. The Walmart in North Dakota is competing heavily. They've had a huge boom, and their workers have other options, so they have to raise their price to pay them. The oil and gas engineers make that much because we have this huge boom in the oil and gas industry right now. They're competing over what those engineers could be doing with that degree. So they're paying based on supply and demand, and that doesn't change just because you're taking minimum wage and applying it to a mom and pop shop, which is largely the businesses that are dealing with minimum wage, these smaller businesses. So the other issue when I talked about how only 15% of workers who make under 1010 come from families in poverty, what that ends up meaning is that minimum wage hikes are harming the exact people that the proponents are claiming that it's going to help. It's harming those poor people, because if you're a poor kid and you want to work your way up in the world and you don't have a lot of skills for whatever reason, your family background and your education and whatever it is, and you're trying to learn those skills, you have to go try and get a job somewhere, and that's where you're going to earn the skill. But if the government says you have to pay this person X amount and that business doesn't think they're worth it, then they're not going to hire them. And no matter what government mandate you talk about, that's not going to change. Go ahead and go to the next slide. So everyone starts out somewhere on a job, but politicians can make it more expensive for us to get that start. And in the end, this all comes down to something pretty simple, because everybody understands, economists of all stripes and anyone who logically thinks about it, they all understand. You can explain those examples of why the Walmart in North Dakota pays that much versus the one here, and why oil and gas engineers make X amount and other people make X amount. And everyone kind of understands that. So the question we're talking about with the minimum wage is, who does a better job of determining the wages of someone? Is it politicians in Lansing, in Washington, D.C.? And by the way, when I looked at this, when Michigan was talking about this, every single politician who was advocating, they had a lot of politicians come out and talk about, this is why we need to raise the minimum wage, and here's how it's going to help people. Every single one of those politicians had unpaid interns in their office. And the reason they had unpaid interns was because they thought, and if you talk to them, they would say, we're providing value, they're getting an education, they're going to come in here, sure, I can't pay them, but in the future they're going to do better off. Well, that's exactly what happens, and whether that person's working for free or whether they're working for $7 or $8 an hour, the principle still holds. They're learning skills on the job with the hope of moving up. And so that is the basis of why we should get rid of minimum wage laws or severely reduce them. And I think I have couple more minutes, so if anyone has any questions, I'm happy to take them. Yeah.
For people in like concentrated cities like Detroit or something like that has less jobs than people, what would you suggest for them to go to less populated city to find more available jobs? Like in North Dakota, obviously there's not a lot of supply of jobs. Right,
yeah. Well, people sometimes do that naturally, depending on, I mean, obviously, yeah, the problem in somewhere like Detroit is it's a lot to ask someone to move and to have those restrictions. But, yeah, the hopes when you have, that Walmart example is a good one, which is they're offering that much, whether to get people where they live or so that other people hear about it and move to that area. That's why the engineering jobs in North Dakota pay so much more. They actually pay a lot more than they do in Michigan or in Massachusetts, and that's because you got to move to North Dakota. I mean, there's not a lot of people there. You got to convince them to come out and live. And one thing about the Detroit example that's interesting for the people who talk about that minimum wage laws are going to lead to this great prosperity. For 2 decades, Detroit has mandated that anyone doing business with the city or works for a contractor has to be paid a living wage, which is set much higher even than the Michigan minimum wage. And so the idea that that can then, on its own, going to lead to prosperity for people, obviously it hasn't worked. Yeah.
You talked about how it would negatively affect like poor and whatnot, but what kind of ripple effect would it have on everyone else? Like how would it affect aspects of other people in the economy in general? Like would it have any other effects other than just hurting the poor, or would it actually like extend outward and do more damage?
Yeah, I mean, the example of talking about harming the poor is because if you have this hypothetical business owner and he has an option between somebody who's a 21-year-old college student who comes from parents who are middle class or up, and he has somebody who is an 18 or 17-year-old kid who's from a single-family home and he didn't go to good schools, but he's willing to work hard and do something, and he can only afford to hire one, he's going to pick the one that's higher educated and has those more skills. So the reason I said that was the thing about having minimum wage or low wage jobs in general is it allows business people to take a chance on someone. And same thing with unpaid internships. The other effects out in the economy, you're seeing some businesses that are able to automate or to get away from people. If you raise the cost of what their employees cost, they're going to do that more quickly. And then if a business has no choice to do that, if they're just the type of business that they really need employees, restaurants that have servers tend to fall in that camp more, well then they'd solve it in other ways by raising the price of food, or something else, which of course has lots of ripple effects on the economy. But of course something you've probably all heard a lot, or I hope you hear this week, that there's no free lunch in the world, and of course minimum wage laws are costing that, they're not coming free. I see at the Mackinac Center, by the way, so for any of you that are interested in policy and stuff, please, I encourage you to look into our internships. They are actually paid. My former intern, Zach Dawes, is out here in the audience, and I'm sure he'll say great things about working with me this summer. So if you are interested in that, mackinac.org is our website.
Our next guest speaker is actually a professor here at Northwood University. Welcome, Cliff Harris.
I'm going to briefly talk about international trade and globalization. I'll start out by talking about globalization. There are basically 4 points to globalization. The first being that globalization provides greater interdependency among nations, meaning that we all are somewhat dependent upon each other. The second point would be that it increases integration of products and resource markets through trade, immigration, and foreign investment. The third thing is that it also includes non-economic elements such as cultural and environmental factors. The fourth thing is that it occurs on a political, technological, and economic level. Now, there are and there have been 4 waves of globalization. The first wave was from 1870 to 1914. It was triggered by technological developments in transportation, i.e. the steam engine and railroads. It was also dominated by European and American businesses. This first wave of globalization was brought to an end by World War I. The second wave of globalization was from 1945 to 1980. It was the result of a reaction against nationalism following World War II. It was also the result of lower transportation costs. It was dominated by industrial nations, with developing nations basically being excluded, which led to a greater increase in per capita income for those industrialized countries and less for developing countries. The third wave of globalization is from 1980 until the present. It has included some, but not all, developing countries. It's been featured with increased capital movement, meaning capital is moving from one country to another country. There's also been a decline in the mobility of labor. In a lot of instances, what's happening is we are outsourcing. And when we talk about outsourcing, we're outsourcing not only blue-collar jobs, but also white-collar jobs. And they're moving from the U.S. to lower-cost areas. Now, when we start to talk about the importance of globalization, there are three very, very important points. The first being the law of comparative advantage. When we talk about comparative advantage, what happens is countries can benefit by producing goods for which they have a low opportunity cost. They can also trade those with other nations that have a higher opportunity cost in a particular good. The second thing is it leads to increased competition. Having competition is a great thing because ultimately competition lowers prices for consumers. As consumers, we are always happy when we are able to get a lower price. The third thing is we talk about open economies. When we talk about open economies, they lead to increased technological development and innovation. Now, when we start to talk about these open economies, basically what originally happened was there were a number of nations that didn't have open economies. They were mercantilists. They felt that they could sell their products, reap a lot of gold and silver, and at the same time benefit. As a result of them selling all of their products, what ended up happening was the prices at home got to the point where people weren't able to afford them, which ultimately led to goods now being imported again. There are also what are known as three fallacies of international trade. One of those fallacies is that trade is a zero-sum game. Very, very incorrect. Because if every time you trade with someone you lose, would you continue to trade? The answer is absolutely not. So what happens is both countries can gain by specializing. The second fallacy is that basically international trade reduces domestic employment. We hear this all the time especially when it comes down to labor unions. They say it because they want you to protect their jobs. Well, what happens is ultimately specific industries may suffer, but overall employment increases. Often what happens is you lose jobs in one industry, but jobs in other industries open up. And the third fallacy is that trade restrictions are beneficial. When we talk about trade restrictions, what we're ultimately talking about is having quotas, having tariffs. Ultimately, that reduces our purchasing power, okay? Not only of our nation, but other nations, and it leads to retaliatory actions. Often, what happens is there are threats to workers. The first threat would be that it is painful to unskilled workers in the U.S. because they end up losing their jobs. The second thing is that companies may move production to other countries which exploit or use environmental resources. The third thing is it's a similar threat created by technological improvements, which increase efficiency. Now, think about this. If you are more technologically advanced, then ultimately you should be a lot more efficient. And if you're more efficient, then ultimately it leads to more jobs. Now, there are ultimately 5 criticisms of globalization. The first criticism is that free trade benefits U.S. corporations rather than citizens. Absolutely not. Because if it doesn't benefit citizens, then ultimately there's no need in having it. The second is that it is environmentally exploiting other nations. Well, ultimately what happens is as countries start to become more wealthy, they become more conscious of their environment. They tend to want to have a cleaner environment. The third thing is there are human rights issues, okay? Are people ultimately working 20-hour days? Probably not. In some instances, what happens is their wages may start out low, but as they get exposed to goods and services, they tend to want a better life. The fourth thing is that it is a reduction in domestic wages. Yes, that can happen, but remember, these are jobs that are not necessarily highly skilled. And the fifth thing is that lower domestic competitiveness as a result of developing facilities elsewhere. Well, what happens is if you build a better mousetrap, ultimately people will buy the product. When we start to look at nations, a lot of times we talk about nations and going through the infant industry. Well, some instances we have the government protect these agencies. The question becomes, how long do we protect them? Okay? Now, at some point, because all products go through a product life cycle, so ultimately, initially you're building the product, then you're taking and you're exporting the product, then next thing you know, you're actually building the product somewhere else, you lose your comparative advantage, and now lastly, you start to buy the product from someplace else. I think that about does it for my time. Are there any questions? Yes.
Would you encourage the lifting of the embargo on Cuba,
probably just simply because it's so close to us, and there are a number of benefits, and maybe upon the powers that be changing hands, that might happen. Anybody else? Thank you.
Our next guest speaker is another professor here at Northwood, Tim Nash.
I'd like to start off by answering the question to Mr. Harris. The answer is yes, we should open trade with Cuba so that we could all have good cigars at a reasonable price. First of all, I would like to congratulate Alex for putting Freedom Week together. Alex, what a great job. Why don't we give Alex a round of applause? For the last 3 years, I've had the privilege of working with some of my colleagues at Northwood and some colleagues at Central Michigan, Rutgers University, the Harvard MIT Data Research Center, a graduate student at the Notre Dame Law School, and one of our recent alums who was a dual major in economics and finance, who now works for Chemical Bank, in putting together a competitiveness study for the Michigan Chamber of Commerce. We released in September the third edition of the study, and Alex asked me to speak a little bit about the Michigan competitiveness study and its impact on Michigan and certainly on right to work in Michigan. When we were approached by the Chamber of Commerce, Dale, if you want to put the next slide up, we had a long conversation with the Chamber of Commerce, and we put together a team of faculty that were left of center, right of center. You had a bunch of economists with dramatically differing points of view, so you've all heard that saying, how difficult it would be to herd cats. Well, it's really difficult to herd a bunch of economists, especially, you had somebody like Deb Chakraborty, who was kind of left to center at Central Michigan, and Richard Ebling, kind of right of center here at Northwood, and Adam O'Kunlitz at Rutgers is even further left to center than Chakraborty at Central Michigan. But what we did was we put together an analysis of competition and what makes countries, nations, and then states competitive. And so this first slide that I have up here is just for you folks to take a look at and to think about, the kinds of things that drive competitiveness. Now, other than what the former First Lady and recent Secretary of State of the United States, Mrs. Clinton, said the other day in Massachusetts, businesses do create jobs. Entrepreneurs do create jobs. Government has very little to do with creating jobs, and in fact, in most cases, government can be an impediment to creating jobs. And so the first few slides that I want to just take you through very quickly with some of the macro and global research that we did in this competitiveness study, and then I'll give you a point of view on what's happening in right-to-work states versus non-right-to-work states, and certainly what's happening in Michigan. But if you look at this slide, you basically see the entrepreneurial process. You see, that entrepreneurs go out there and they try to satisfy customer needs, they take risks, and they try to produce the best possible products at the most competitive price. If I asked you in 1900, if there were 100 companies in the Fortune 100, which there were, how many of those 100 companies in 2014, 114 years later, how many of those companies would still be in the Fortune 100, meaning the 100 largest publicly traded companies in America? Any idea? 3? Anybody else? 10? 17? Whoever said 1 is correct. And it's General Electric. You know, we had companies like the Ohio Matchbook Company. You know, some of you are so young you've never seen a matchbox or you've never struck a match. You know, we've had 4 weddings, and my wife and I were commenting the other day that we've never given out a matchbook with the name of our son or daughter with their spouse on the match cover. But, you know, that was something big when we were married almost 36 years ago. And that producing matchbooks for all the different uses, lighting a stove at home, you know, maybe lighting a generator, lighting wood in your furnace, which most homes were still fueled by coal or by wood. You know, so it's a dramatically different time. Now, if you look at the competitive functions within the United States, here's a slide, gang, that basically shows that we don't fare well in K through 12 education. This is the most recent international study by PISA, and as you can see, we're nothing to write home to mom about in math, science, and languages. If you look at and so we're talking about the kinds of things that allow businesses to compete. This slide shows the level of government consumption of GDP. In 1900, government consumed less than 8% of GDP. That was local, state, and federal government via taxes, via spending, via cost of deficits. It took less than 8% of GDP, which meant that if you made $1, on average, you got to keep 92 cents. There was no income tax in 1900. Today, government consumes almost 40% of GDP, which means on average, if you make $1, government keeps roughly 40 cents on the dollar. Here's another way of taking a look at things. But if you look at taxes on business, you know, the United States used to be a moderate to low tax country. We now have the highest tax rate in the industrialized world. If you take the average state and local plus the federal income tax rate of 35%, we have an average tax rate of 40%. We surpassed Japan last year as the #1 corporate income tax rate in the industrialized world. Not something that attracts businesses to the United States. And you know, when people say, well, geez, these American companies have their revenues overseas, you can see why. We have a tax rate, Ireland's is 13%, China's is 24%, India's is 30%. We tax our businesses at an average tax rate of 40%. If you look at regulations, this is the Wall Street Journal Heritage Foundation Freedom Index, and it measures the level of taxes or the level of the cost of government, especially regulation. 1995, we were number 4 in the world. Today, we're number 12. And the estimate is that by 2015, we're going to be 15 or 16. The size and scope of government, not just in terms of taxes, not just in terms of government consumption by dollars, but regulations, the regulatory cost is increasing. Our national debt, we have not served you well. You should be mad at me, maybe Alex, he's probably too young, Cliff, my wife, because we haven't served you well. From 1776 to 1982, we had a national debt, 205 years, 206 years, it was less than $1 trillion. We haven't done anything on a minor scale from 1982 to date. We've gone from $1 trillion national debt to a $17.6 trillion national debt. Not good. Market, the economy in the United States. And so the real question then is, if you're, some of you are taking macroeconomics, you've already taken macroeconomics, some of you will take macroeconomics. You know, the basic circular flow, what's the role of government relative to households and business? And if you look at it, it's business that creates jobs. Government's very important. I'm not an anarchist, I'm not anti-government, but I do favor a limited government. And I think that when you take a look at the wisdom of Milton Friedman in the introduction to When We Are Free, talking about the power of ideas and the power of people to make a difference. This is what he's talking about. The fact that the size and scope of government can get out of control and can curtail business growth, job growth, standards of living, and a country's ability to defend itself, and a country's ability to have longevity. And so one of the great questions has to be, what is the proper role of government? And so one of the things that we looked at with the study, when the Chamber asked us in 2012 to put together the study, we took a look at Michigan from some data as far back as 1998 all the way to today with this year's study, or from 2000 all the way to today, and we looked at the average across a number of these areas. And so this is net population growth, people leaving your state versus coming into your state, people dying versus people being born. Now this is, and by the way, this whole study is available on our website if this interests you. You can get all these slides. First one to come up can have my slides tonight if you need them for some event or some project you're working on. But and by the way, I'm looking for a couple of good researchers for next year's study, so let me know if this interests you. So if you look at the next slide, what you see is, here's Michigan versus Great Lakes states versus the national average, and you can see that right-to-work states, these are generally states that are more labor-friendly. They say if you want to join a union, you can, but if you choose not to join a union, you don't have to. Right-to-work states have gained over 5 million jobs since 2000, and non-right-to-work states have lost a population, jobs and people, a population of over 5 million people. If you take a look at the next slide and you analyze this particular analysis of looking at things like, or trying to analyze the, one of the things that I think is important to take a look at or to think about is if you analyze gross state product. And this one we went back to 1998. And so we have 15 years, 16 years worth of data on this. You look at where Michigan happened to be, and now if you look at the next slide, look at Michigan. We were the worst, and still are overall, the worst performing state over that 16-year period. But look at right-to-work states outperform non-right-to-work states by about 15 percentage points in terms of GDP or gross state product growth. And so when you look at those issues or those variables, it's interesting to see how effective or how efficient %, what it's averaged the last 3 years nationally, what it's averaged when you take into consideration the last 6 years. Again, the U.S. economy is slowing down. We're not growing at the growth rate that we'd like to. But the good news, if you look at the next slide, is that Michigan truly is a comeback state. If you look at what's happened to Michigan in the last 3 years, and I'll give the House and the Senate, Democrats and Republicans working together to some degree. I'll give our governor a lot of the credit. We've cut taxes. We've especially cut taxes on business and made them more friendly. We've reduced the cost of regulations by over 600 regulations either being reduced or eliminated. And if you look at Michigan, Michigan's the #1 growth state for GDP the last 3 years. It was the #1 growth rate state in the Great Lakes region, and it outpaced the U.S. growth rate by more than a half point in terms of GDP growth. And if you look at the last couple of slides, it just shows Michigan versus the states by year in the Great Lakes region, and then it shows Michigan in the Great Lakes region versus the last slide shows versus the rest of the country. And what I'd like to say to you folks in conclusion is this. that when we first put together the study in 2009, we also ranked Michigan from 2000 to 2011 data for 2012. And we ranked Michigan the 47th out of 50 states in terms of competitiveness. And it was not good news. The governor didn't like it. The Chamber of Commerce didn't like it. But we said, that's the data. We did the study the next year, and Michigan, because it was improving, moved from 47 to 39. And that's over that longer period of time. This year we came out with the study, and from 2000 to 2013, Michigan had actually moved up to number 30. And if you looked at Michigan for the last 3 years, we ranked Michigan the 20th most competitive state in the country. Michigan's 22nd in wage growth. Michigan is number 20 in new business starts. Michigan's number 12 in business tax friendliness. If you take all the taxes in Michigan under consideration from a business perspective, we rank Michigan number 11th. The Tax Foundation ranked Michigan number 12. And so the point with it is, what is the reason for the comeback or the change, I believe, the improvement in Michigan. We're not back yet. We're not the state we were 30 or 40 years ago. But a lot of it has to do with an environment that is pro-business, that is not anti-government, but is a state that has the kind of relationship that allows businesses to come to fruition in the state and other businesses to want to come to Michigan. And so I think as we benchmark to states like Texas, Michigan's best days are ahead of it. Thank you.
Our last guest speaker is another Northwood University professor. Welcome, Alex Tokarev.
When I was a kid growing up in Bulgaria, we had only one TV channel, and this time, every evening, there was a show for kids. It's called Leka noć deca, Good Night Children. And they would tell a story, and I have my good night story for you now here. It's about a friend of mine. This friend of mine runs a small construction business in the Midwest, about 600 miles south of here. One year he invested his time and money on a project to build a retirement duplex villas for another company. He carefully studied the plans, he negotiated all the specifications, he turned in several bids and signed the contract. Then he hired professionals, he rented the equipment necessary, and he took his crew to the site to break ground. Within minutes, local labor union bosses and their goons surrounded the construction workers. My friend revealed that his was not a union shop. He could not have won the bid if he had to pay the artificially high labor union rates. And this is where the threats began. He was told to pack up and go voluntarily, or the union bosses would call for backup, placing a picket across the only road to the construction site. It's a gate that would effectively block all materials and shut down the project. My friend called his electrician, his plumber, his excavator, all of them members of unions, to find out what's happening, how seriously he should be taking those threats. And they all told him that no one would dare to cross the picket line. Don't workers have the basic freedom, the inalienable human right, if you wish, to decide whether to unionize or not without fear of retribution? The story of my friend explains why I signed a petition written by several leading economists in support of legislation that would limit the abuse of power by big labor, not just in one state but nationwide. We have to stop the threats, the extortion, the acts of violence committed by those who falsely claim to stand up for the interests of the workers. Milton Friedman, my great defense against the dark arts teacher, noted the following: when unions get higher wages for their members by restricting entry into an occupation, those higher wages are at the expense of other workers who find their opportunities reduced. When government pays its employees higher wages, those higher wages are at the expense of the taxpayer. But when workers get higher wages and better working conditions through the free market, when they get raises by firms competing with one another for the best workers, by workers competing with one another for the best jobs, those higher wages are at nobody's expense. They can only come from higher productivity, greater capital investment, more widely diffused skills. The whole pie gets bigger. There is more for the worker, but there is also more for the employer, the investor, the consumer, and even the tax collector. That's the way the free market system distributes the fruits of economic progress among all people. That is the secret of the enormous improvements in the conditions of the working person over the past 2 centuries. Thank you very much for being here on day 2 of the Freedom Week. We'll see you again tomorrow night, same time. Thank you.